Pope Francis has passed away at the age of 88. It's after a protracted battle with pneumonia towards the latter stage of his life. The Pope, of course, taking up the seat back in March of 2013. It's after his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, declared that he was unfit to continue leading the 1.4 billion Catholics during his own papacy. And since then, of course, Pope Francis has charted his own path in many ways, seen as a pope of many firsts. He's the first South American pope born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, the first pope to take up the name Francis, and the first pope in many instances, I suppose, to rattle feathers both in and outside the church, given his very unique reading of theology. You might have heard there from our package from Kailitle Kumalo mentioning those now famous comments around homosexuality. Who am I to judge, he said, as he was asked to reflect on whether or not Pope Francis might lead the church to a different understanding of same-sex relations, or people who the church describes as having same-sex inclinations. Let's continue making sense of this moment and bring in now our international desk editor, that's Sophie Mokoena, who joins us via our telephone line. And Sophie, it's great to have you on this Easter Monday, and I suppose there's something a bit poetic about the leader of one of the largest churches in the world passing on as the church itself wraps up a pretty holy moment of its liturgical calendar.
Yes, quite an important moment in the history of the Vatican, the passing on of the Pope. We know that he was in hospital for quite a long time, and he was then allowed to go and recover outside hospital. But it was clear even then that he was really going through difficult times. We saw him the past few days making appearances, but very short appearances or brief interaction. You know that he had the team that looked after him a few days ago, visiting him, and that he also visited one of the prisons and spoke to prisoners, but that was a brief interaction. And yesterday we saw him appearing at the balcony, greeting those who gathered outside Vatican. And also we were told, or they did share his sermon where he was calling for peace and calling on the world to attend to the current challenges facing the world. We know that he was very passionate in terms of pushing that there must be a lasting solution to this protracted war in Ukraine, the Middle East, the DRC, Sudan. Those were some of his last requests to mankind in terms of ensuring that those issues or those conflicts are resolved. And we saw that he also met a very short meeting with the Vice President of the United States of America, J.D. Vance, who visited Rome and then the Vatican and then flew out to India. And we are hoping that J.D. Vance, when he is addressing the media later today, our colleagues will be there to capture that. He will touch on his short meeting with the Pope. Unfortunately, this morning, the Vatican announcing that the Pope has passed on.
Let's bring in Father Hugh O'Connor, the Secretary General of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, who is joining us now via our video link to reflect on this moment. Father O'Connor, thank you very much indeed for making time to speak to us. Pope Francis, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Pope of many firsts, in fact, one of the first, if not from Southern Africa. I beg your pardon, the Southern Hemisphere.
No, absolutely. I think each Pope is the Pope for his time, his moment, and is important for what he can offer to the world at that time. And he would have brought to the papacy his experience of being a priest, a bishop, a Jesuit, in a country that faced many, many challenges politically, socially, economically. So his love and concern for the poor would have been born in those circumstances. He would have been shaped, as we all are shaped, by our surroundings. And so we can see throughout his ministry, there's been a constant care, a call for the poor, for migrants, for refugees, for peace. I think also we must take note that while his death is a shock, because, I mean, he was out greeting the crowds, even briefly yesterday, I think it is a beautiful example of somebody who realized after being quite ill that he had come to the end of his journey. He realized that death is part of our life experience. He embraced it in faith. And we can see his preparations for this. I'm sure that he was anxious to get out of hospital. And during this time of being out of hospital, he went to visit the prisoners on Holy Thursday at Regina Coeli prison. He went out amongst the crowds to greet people, to be visible, both at the hospital and also at the Vatican.
All right, Father O'Connor, we're struggling to hear you because of the quality of our connection. I'm going to ask that perhaps our team try to re-establish that connection so we can hold on to what I think are really worthwhile reflections on how Pope Francis spent even his last few days, as Father O'Connor mentioned there, greeting the faithful at St. Peter's Basilica as recently as yesterday. And Sophie Mokoena is also helping us take in this moment, Sophie. And in the past, we know that world leaders will typically converge in the Vatican, in Rome, to mark this moment, which admittedly doesn't happen often. I imagine we're going to be expecting a whole lot of that kind of interaction in the days to come.
Yes, indeed. I think many world leaders will be there during the different sessions of commemoration of the life and time of the Pope until he's laid to rest. And I think it has been a tradition for different leaders to join the church in celebrating and saying goodbye to the Pope when he passed on. And I think we are going to see even many people, ordinary people, traveling to Rome. We are going to see media houses, broadcasters around the world converging, covering this big story. And I think you are correct to say that he was from the southern hemisphere, and therefore his outlook in terms of life and what's happening in the world was quite different. He was a down-to-earth person, and he was able to speak to different people at different times. And it is for that reason, when you look at the recent years, he was really firmly focused on ensuring that he makes a mark in terms of pushing those who were in factions in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Sudan, in the DRC, to find a lasting solution. And you know that he's got a strong following worldwide, including on the continent, and I think different countries. We are going to see the congregation or the people really pouring out in terms of their views and mourning the passing on of the Pope, including here in South Africa. We will continue to get reactions to those who share same views and understanding and condolences in relation to the passing on of the Pope, because the church is huge. It's quite big globally.
Absolutely. 1.3 million faithful, we're told. It's about 17% of the global population. And in fact, even as staggering as those numbers were, Pope Francis was really worried about whether or not the church is losing its resonance with the people. You speak about the tributes that are likely to start flowing in, and in fact they have. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has already released a statement. He's hailed Pope Francis' commitment to the most vulnerable. We've heard from Italy's Prime Minister as well, saying that this news saddens that population quite deeply. She says, I beg your pardon, I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship in a statement. Giorgia Meloni adding that, he has asked the world once again for the courage to change direction, to follow a path that does not destroy but cultivates, repairs and protects. And it's been very fascinating listening in, Sophie, to just how many people have seen Pope Francis as an individual who did things differently, for better or for worse, right? I don't think everybody always agreed with his approach, but what people will agree with is that his approach often was unconventional.
Yes, I think you know that he had a different view in terms of many issues, be it mixed marriage, be it issues of gender, be it issues of equality and issues of peace and security, the challenges of poverty. I remember when he went to hospitals, they had organized at the Vatican a discussion on issues of global poverty. And I remember Advocate Mjangu Gumbi, including the former South African President Thabo Mbeki and other influential people around the world were at the Vatican to participate in those discussions, focusing on issues of poverty, and senior people around the world making inputs in terms of how you can address the issues of poverty, an issue that he's fought for all the time to ensure that the vulnerable are taken care of. And the input from the former South African president on ensuring that the illicit financial outflows, you deal with that because countries will have resources to address the issue of poverty, something that was very dear to his heart. I remember he even appointed high-profile people at some point in time a few years ago, including the former South African Deputy President, as a global committee for the Vatican to deal with what can be done to address the issues of poverty. And I think for South Africa, he might have been far in the Vatican, 1,000 miles away, but he believed in South Africa's input on global matters. That is why I'm talking about this special committee that was supposed to look in terms of what can be done to address the issues of poverty around the world. And him choosing the former South African Deputy President Pumzile to be in that committee. And as I pointed out, when he went to the hospital, he was supposed to have participated in that workshop or summit or seminar where the former South African President Thabo Mbeki was and Advocate Mjangu Gumbi, but he couldn't participate in that seminar because he then went to the hospital a day before the seminar started. That's who he was. He was almost like a socialist, and I think the speaker before me summed it well to say that it was based on the region he came from. And Argentina as a country, what the country went through in the South developing countries. And therefore, he was passionate about changing the lives of the most vulnerable in different parts of the world. And his key message in recent times: stop the war in Ukraine, stop the war in the Middle East, stop the war in Sudan, stop the war in South Sudan, stop the war, the conflict in the DRC. This is who he was, fighting for the most vulnerable and also the poor.
It comes as no surprise, of course, that he's made several trips to the African continent. My understanding is that he's been to Africa about 4 times and visited 8 countries in total, including Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic. And in fact, I imagine many of the faithful in Africa, we're told about 272 million of them, will also be watching this very closely, given the influence of the church in the African continent. Sophie, we know of many schools that have been built by the church and are still operational today, and many churches themselves that are involved in almsgiving in a number of far-flung communities.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you go to countries such as Lesotho, for example, you even have monuments or structures that symbolize the visit of the previous Pope. And also I remember going to Uganda, the previous Pope, visiting Uganda and Kenya. That speaks to the religion on the continent in South Africa, but also at some point in time, the Nelson Mandela Foundation had planned to invite the Pope Francis, who has passed on, to deliver a lecture. But unfortunately, COVID came, and therefore people couldn't travel, people couldn't converge. But I know that the foundation was working very hard, trying to get him to deliver the Nelson Mandela lecture, one of the lectures around issues of poverty, because people felt that he belonged to all of them. And he was very accessible. I mean, you would imagine if they want to invite a pope to deliver a lecture, it's because people understood then that, or the foundation understood that he was a person who was approachable. And you go to many other countries and we will see during the day and the days to come what's going to happen in different countries in terms of people who will be paying tribute to the Pope. And the broadcasters around the world will be there to capture that important moment.
Without a doubt. And in fact, we are showing our viewers live visuals of St. Peter's Basilica, where already there's a whole lot more movement now than there was even just half an hour ago. And I imagine, as you mentioned, Sophie, that international media will soon descend on that particular part of Rome and, in fact, interact with the millions of people who are likely to come from around the world in order to pay their respects and essentially mark this moment in history. I don't think you need to be religious in order to essentially take in the historical significance of what's just taken place. Certainly not the kind of event that happens very often, especially when you consider that a pope is a pope for life. And Father O'Connor, apologies about our gremlins earlier on. Hopefully we have a much clearer line to you. And as we continue taking stock of just the context in which Pope Francis ascended to the papacy, it'd be remiss of us not to speak about the circumstances under which that happened. Benedict XVI decided he just wasn't strong enough to continue, and Pope Francis was the guy who had to step into the breach and negotiate that delicate balance where, for the first time in a long time, there were 2 popes that were alive at the same time.
Yes, there were 2 popes in a way, but there is always only one pope. There's only one person who carries the authority of the church and authority to lead. So there was only one person, and that was Pope Francis on the seat of Peter, in the office of Peter. Pope Benedict stepped aside and wanted to spend the rest of his life in prayer and reflection, and he did just that in a building in the Vatican grounds. I think there's a lot of conspiracy. A lot of people want to create conflict, but we see that when the 2 men did meet, there was a genuine love, a genuine affection between them. They came from 2 very, very different worlds, 2 very, very different experiences of church. And they both, at their heart and at the root of their lives, wanted to make the gospel of Jesus Christ open, available,
understood to all. Both had an embrace of the world, but each in their own way. Just like John Paul II, an entirely different character, formed in a Polish context, was a sort of super pope of his time. He was the first one that went out traveling. You had John the 23rd of the Vatican Council, also a man of his time, shaped by his experiences as an ambassador, as a pastor, somebody who reached out and who wanted to open the doors of the church. So each pope faces very different circumstances. And as Catholics, we believe that the Pope is chosen by the cardinals gathered in the conclave through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So there's always, and there should be, a surprise.
Right.
So yes, now we face another surprise. We pray for the gift of the Holy Spirit for those cardinals who will be going to Rome, and we will have Cardinal Brislin, or the Archbishop of Johannesburg, who will be traveling to Rome, and as he is under 80, he will also be voting in the conclave as well.
Sure, and of course for many people outside the church, it's always quite interesting to watch, for lack of a better term, the drama around the electing of the next pope. We all wait with bated breath in some instances for that white smoke to start billowing from the Vatican, signaling that indeed there is a successor to St. Peter. But we'll speak about that in just a bit more detail, if you allow me, Father, to just continue distilling through what you reckon Pope Francis's contribution has been. And I want to preface that by making reference to Vatican II, which many people say has marked a seismic shift for the Catholic Church. Yes, it didn't vouch for the changing of core doctrinal or theological precepts, but it did force the Catholic Church to interact differently with the modern world. And it wasn't an easy process. I wonder to what extent you feel Francis has also contributed to that, challenged people in the pews and perhaps even priests and cardinals to not change the doctrine, but interact differently with the faithful.
I think the Vatican II was a council of its moment, of its time. It was after the war, the world was changing, and Pope John the 23rd said, how do we preach the gospel in this changing world? And that is what every single council tries to do. It looks at the signs of the times, it looks at what is happening around, and it attempts to speak into that context. Now, we need to realize that the movement of history is a long time. And when you bring about change, there are those who embrace it, and there are those who resist it. And this is a perfectly natural thing. And it's been the same with the Vatican Council, that there have been some who have warmly embraced it, warmly embraced the new winds that flowed through the church, and there are others who have been more critical of them. One of the challenges that Pope Francis really embraced was to make the social teachings of the church come alive in a world where there is a desperate need for peace, for care, for concern, for love and compassion. And we see across the world at this current time a real brutalization of relationships, a real hardening of attitudes, especially to the marginalized. And he encouraged the church and the leadership of the church, as well as the clergy and the religious, to come out of safe spaces. When he said quite famously, the priest must come out of the sacristy. That's where we prepare for Mass. And they must get out of the churches and meet people where they're at. Meet people, embrace people, and actually be living examples of God's love, God's compassion, and God's grace. So that has been also a really challenging message because it's hard work. Reaching out to people and meeting them where they're at and being open to them pastorally is not easy and requires that each leader, each priest actually grows their heart. And Pope Francis was the example of somebody who over his entire life span had worked to grow the openness of his heart.
Sure. It's certainly been a interesting kind of thing to observe, especially when you consider just how many people would have interpreted his different decisions differently. But I suppose we've got time to really take stock of all of that, given this, let's face it, a seminal moment for the church itself and for the many people that we're seeing already streaming in at St. Peter's Square in Rome. That's where we're showing you live visuals there on your screen, following the news, of course, of the passing of Pope Francis at the age of 88. The time, we're told, was around 25 minutes towards 8 o'clock this morning. At least that is the record from the Vatican, who had announced the passing of Pope Francis earlier on today. And in fact, St. Peter's Basilica, the successor of St. Peter himself, is going to be a big central point as we take in what this means for a church that even Pope Francis himself was worried could in fact lose resonance with the world in which it is, if in fact there wasn't a reckoning with the challenges of today. And so, Mokwena, to bring you back into this discussion, I suppose that's going to be a big part of what Francis's legacy has always been, reckoning with reality and trying to bridge whatever gap people felt existed between the Catholic Church and the challenges of this world.
Yes, indeed. His legacy will be the one where many people will embrace and also remember, because he was there for the vulnerable, as I pointed out, including on issues of gender, race, color, creed. He was someone who was embracing the human race in totality. He didn't discriminate. He was a man for peace, a servant for peace, because even in his twilight days, he emphasized the importance of peace around the world, mentioning those hotspots. And he didn't shy away to strengthen his resolve in terms of ensuring that his voice is heard and it's loud and clear that there's no need for these killings and these wars and conflicts around the world. That was his strong message. As I pointed out, that when you look at the latest statements from him, he was really concerned about the current hotspots around the world, including the ones on the continent, and also the issue of poverty. As I pointed out, that he even had a committee that he wanted to ensure that they are focused and advising the Vatican around issues of how you deal with issues of poverty. At the last summit at the Vatican, where you had influential people looking at the challenges facing the globe in relation to cost of living and also poverty and instability, that summit or that meeting he couldn't address because he then had to go to the hospital.
Absolutely. Sophie Mokwena is SABC News International Desk Editor. Father Hugh O'Connor is the Secretary General of the Southern African Bishops' Conference. And this is the SABC News channel taking in the big story making international headlines at this hour. If you've just joined us, news from the Vatican this morning that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. It marks a seminal shifting point, many people will say, in the evolution of the church, as of course they take in the contributions made by this man born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, the first pope from the global south, and his unconventional ways of going about leading a church with 1.3 odd billion people.